Big debates are heating up in Philadelphia as delegates argue over slavery at the Constitutional Convention. Governor Morris from Pennsylvania is calling slavery a curse and refusing to support it, while Charles Pinckney of South Carolina says that his state won't join the Union if the slave trade is banned. Meanwhile, Roger Sherman of Connecticut is trying to calm things down, suggesting that it's better to compromise than risk losing the southern states. The question of slavery is dividing delegates in the United States, so let's get into what really happened at the Constitutional Convention using excerpts from Madison. We can't start talking about the Constitutional Convention without going over three of the key delegates that were there. First, we have Governor Morris from Pennsylvania. He strongly opposed slavery and the idea of counting enslaved people for representation in the southern states. He called slavery a nefarious institution and a curse of heaven. He argued that if slaves were considered people, they should be granted full citizenship and voting rights. He strongly opposed the idea of giving southern states more power because the slavery was unjust. Another key delegate involved with the Constitutional Convention was Charles Pinckney. Pinckney from South Carolina defended slavery as an essential to southern states' economies and insisted that South Carolina would not accept the Constitution if the importation of slaves were banned. In Madison's notes, it stated that Pinckney considered the fisheries in the western frontier as more burdensome to the U.S. than the slaves. He claimed slavery benefited not just the South but the whole Union since it increased agricultural production, trade, and revenue. He also argued that slavery had existed in many societies throughout history, so it was not unusual or dishonorable for the United States. He added that South Carolina can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade, which means that South Carolina would not accept the Constitution if slaves were to be banned. While there were many more delegates involved with the Constitutional Convention, the third and last one that I'm going to be covering is Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman from Connecticut disapproved of the slave trade but supported leaving the issue untouched in the Constitution to preserve unity. He argued that since the southern states already had the legal right to import slaves, and since the national government needed all states to join, it was best to leave the matter as we find it. Sherman believed that slavery would eventually fade away over time and that pressing the issue in 1787 might break apart the fragile Union. While Roger Sherman personally disapproved of slavery, he supported the compromise to preserve the Union, and he accepted the Three-Fifths Compromise for the sake of progress. Now that we've talked about three key delegates from the debate, let's get into more of the course and tone. Madison's notes reveal that slavery was one of the most serious issues at the convention, with delegates sharply split between their moral values and their economic needs. Governor Morris denounced slavery as a nefarious institution and argued that it was unjust to give southern states more representation for enslaved people, while other delegates like Luther Martin and Mason called the trade dishonorable and inconsistent with the Revolution. In contrast, southern delegates like Charles Pinckney argued that slavery benefited the entire Union, and General Pinckney declared that South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. Some northern delegates like Roger Sherman and Ellsworth disliked slavery but accepted compromise, believing that it was better to leave the matter as we find it to hold the Union together. The divide showed in votes as well. On June 11th, most states, including Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, supported the Three-Fifths rule, while New Jersey and Delaware opposed. Overall, the tone was serious and competitive, but the North ultimately compromised because they were forced by the threat that southern states would reject the Constitution if slavery were restricted. Now that we've covered that, we're going to go ahead and move into our analysis of state motivations. First, we have South Carolina and Georgia. Both states strongly supported both the continuation of the slave trade and counting slaves for representation. This is seen when General Pinckney declared that South Carolina and Georgia can't do without slaves, and Charles Pinckney argued that slavery enriched not only the South but the whole Union through increased production, trade, and revenue. The next state we're going to talk about is Virginia, and while there isn't that much specifically on Virginia in this excerpt, we can see that Virginia did oppose the slave trade. We can see this through George Mason when he condemned the slave trade as an internal traffic and said that it was dishonorable to the American character, which noted Virginia's past attempts to stop it. They strongly opposed the inclusion of slavery in representation and condemned its morality. This is seen when Governor Morris called slavery a nefarious institution, which we've quoted before, and argued that it was unjust to count slaves as part of its representation unless they were granted full rights as citizens. Connecticut, their opinion was that they personally disapproved of slavery, but they favored compromise to preserve unity. This is seen when Roger Sherman stated that it was best to leave the matter as we find it to reduce objections to the Constitution, while Ellsworth argued that the morality of slavery should be left to the states. The last two states we have to talk about are New Jersey and Delaware. They both opposed the Three-Fifths Compromise and counting slaves for representation. This is seen when on the June 11th vote, both states voted against the motion to count 3/5 of enslaved people towards representation. The final outcome of the debate over slavery was a compromise that gave both sides something that they wanted. Southern delegates secured additional political power through the 3/5 rule that they agreed to on June 11th, which allowed part of their enslaved population to count towards representation in Congress. They made sure to stand tall in their stance that both South Carolina and Georgia would never accept the Constitution without that guarantee. On the other side, delegates who opposed slavery had a small win: unity. Northern delegates like Mason and Morris spoke strongly against slavery, calling it a curse of heaven and an internal traffic, but they agreed to compromise to preserve the unity that they wanted to have. Both Northern and Southern delegates made their objections clear, showing the deep divisions in morality and economic motives that the Three-Fifths Compromise had to bridge to keep the Union together.